Hello and welcome back to Décolonisation, le Vietnam, English version. Episode 4, Uncle Ho's Long March. Last time we parted ways in 1930. And let me give you a quick summary of what we talked about. Basically, after the French conquests in the late 19th century, the first people to rise up were the mandarins of the old royal power. These guys were suppressed by the French and Indochina was born. Afterwards, with Phan Boi Chau and Phan Chu Trinh, Vietnamese nationalism tried to rebuild the country by looking abroad, towards Japan on one hand, and by working by France on the other hand to give Vietnamese people a say in their own country. But the French were not interested at all. With no avenue then to citizenship, the youth in Vietnam became radicalized in words, with Nguyen An Ninh, but also in action, as the example of Nguyen Thai Hoc show. Hoc founded the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, the VNQDD, and that party launched the failed insurrection in Yên Bai. And that's where we stopped last time. And I know I told you at the end of the last episode that we would cover today the events between 1930 and the Second World War. However, we need to step back a little bit. But hear me out. Hear me out. The thing is that today is the day where Ho Chi Minh enters our story. And as you agree, he's kind of a big deal in Vietnamese history. So he deserves to be welcomed on stage with a bit of fanfare. So here we go. We're stepping back today all the way to June 1919. And the place to be that summer was Versailles. Yes, where the castle is, not far from Paris, la France. As part of the Paris Peace Conference, all the world leaders were meeting in Versailles to decide what the world should look like after World War I. The most powerful leader in Versailles was, of course, the US President, Woodrow Wilson. A few months before that, in a famous speech, Wilson had outlined 14 points for lasting peace in the world. And one thing he seemed to be promising to all the peoples of the world was self-determination. Well, that is exactly why a young Vietnamese man made the trip to Versailles one day in June 1919. The young man was very thin and frail, with an emaciated face and piercing eyes. And to maximize his chances of meeting Wilson, he was wearing a morning coat that he had rented for the occasion. One has to look the part when one goes to Versailles. But what was this young man doing in Versailles? Well, his objective was to personally submit a petition to Wilson. And this petition, written in French, was titled Les revendications du peuple annamite, or in English, the demands of the Annamese people. And just in case you forgot, Annamite is the term that the French use to refer to Vietnamese people. Well, this young man wanted to personally submit this petition to Wilson. He was ambitious. You gotta give it to him. In contrast to his ambition, the petition was very moderate. This is how it started. Quote, "While waiting for the principle of national self-determination to pass from ideal to reality through the effective recognition of the sacred right of all peoples to decide their own destiny, the inhabitants of the ancient empire of Annam, at the present time French Indochina, present to the noble governments of the Entente in general, and in particular to the honorable French government, the following humble claims." End quote. The petition then listed 8 demands, including the establishment of rule of law instead of rule by decree, freedom of the press and the right of free association in Vietnam, freedom of emigration and of foreign travel, and lastly, Vietnamese representation in the French Parliament. And the petition was signed for the group of Vietnamese patriots Nguyen Ai Quoc. Let me tell you right away, the future Ho Chi Minh, because that's who the frail young man is. Well, Ho Chi Minh did not meet President Wilson, and best case scenario is that his petition ended up in the wastebasket of some lower level American diplomat. But what you may be wondering at this stage is how on earth did Ho Chi Minh end up in Versailles in 1919? So let us rewind a bit again and I will tell you. The future Ho Chi Minh was born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890 in Nghệ An province in central Vietnam. His father was a Mandarin, and young Ho Chi Minh, and let's call him Ho Chi Minh from now on to simplify, even though you agree, I agree, we agree that he's not yet Ho Chi Minh. So young Ho Chi Minh started traditional training based on the teaching of Chinese characters to follow the footsteps of his father and become a Mandarin. In addition, he certainly obtained the Franco-Indigenous Primary Education Certificate, and he enrolled at the prestigious National Academy of Hue in 1907. However, in 1909, Ho Chi Minh fled to Saigon, aged 19. Why? Well, it depends who you ask. There are three versions of the story, and the first two have to do with Ho Chi Minh's own father. The father's Mandarin career ended abruptly in 1909, and after that, suddenly Ho Chi Minh's chances of becoming a Mandarin himself were reduced to zero. What is not clear though is why the father lost his position. The first option is that he was opposing colonial powers and the French got rid of him. According to another version, however, the father's career ended when, in a drunken rage, he beat one of his subjects to death. Well, I know which version I want out there if I want to be the father of the nation. I would even prefer the third scenario that said that Ho Chi Minh fled to Saigon because he was expelled from the National Academy after lending support to a peasants' revolt, and that he was wanted by the colonial police for that act of rebellion. I don't know. What is undoubtedly true is that Ho Chi Minh, when he fled to Saigon in 1909, was already politicized and had been involved in nationalist politics. When he fled to Saigon, he laid low for roughly 2 years, working odd jobs until 1911. That year, Ho Chi Minh found a job as an assistant cook on a steamer bound for France, and he left Vietnam with one objective: learn more about European civilization before coming back and rebuilding his country. And he went to work as soon as he arrived in Marseille. He sent an application for admission to a government school training bureaucrats for service in the colonies. At this stage, like many nationalists back then, Ho Chi Minh believed that the modern Vietnam had more chances to be built working with the French, not against them. However, Ho Chi Minh never received an answer to his application. After that, he traveled extensively between Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. In Marseille, London, New York, Dakar, Ho Chi Minh mingled with sailors, workers, soldiers of every nationality, many of them colonial subjects who wanted to be free from their overlords. And that's when Ho Chi Minh started building a large network with nationalists from all over the world. And that network will come in handy later on. After World War I, in 1918, Ho Chi Minh settled in Paris and became friends with other nationalist compatriots, including our friend Nguyen An Ninh and the venerable Phan Chu Trinh. Remember, Albert Sarraut had sent Trinh to Paris to keep him away from Vietnam. While in Paris, Trinh became a mentor to many young Vietnamese nationally minded students. Trinh was almost 50 years old. He had been to prison, he had written extensively, he had traveled the world, so it is understandable that he became the leader of the small group that called itself the Group of Annamese Patriots. Under Trinh's tutelage, Ho Chi Minh deepened his thinking and began to write articles about the new Vietnam. And upon learning that the Koreans, the Chinese, and the Algerians had submitted petitions to President Wilson in May 1919, Ho Chi Minh got together with two other young nationalists in the Trinh's orbit, and they wrote together the demands of the Annamese people. Hence the morning coat, and hence the trip to Versailles with the petition sign Nguyen Ai Quoc. This nickname initially referred to the signatories of the demands, but Ho Chi Minh adopted it and kept it until 1945. So Ho Chi Minh had been inspired by petitions filed by the Koreans and the Algerian Emir Khaled, who also wrote to Wilson. But what is striking is that contrary to those petitions, there was nothing about independence in the Vietnamese petition. The word independence is not even mentioned. The Vietnamese patriots simply demanded that the French honor the promises Albert Sarraut had made. And we can see here that in June 1919, Ho Chi Minh was still on the same line as Phan Chu Trinh, meaning that he still believed in reforms within the French Republic. He was what historian Frederick Logoval calls a Francophile anti-colonialist. You see, this is the contradiction at the heart of French colonization. It came under the challenge of people who were inspired by French education itself. People like Ho Chi Minh, Nguyen An Ninh, and others had read The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, therefore embraced popular sovereignty. They had studied Voltaire and his condemnation of tyranny. And these people knew Victor Hugo's advocacy for liberty and his support for workers' uprising. So people like young Ho Chi Minh or Phan Chu Trinh could not understand why these ideals defined by these good French people did not apply to them. But the trip to Versailles was a personal watershed moment for Ho Chi Minh. After that, he started to move away from that position, from this Phan Chu Trinh's reformist line of thought. What happened after Versailles is that Ho Chi Minh realized that when President Wilson was pontificating about self-determination, he did not have Koreans or Vietnamese in mind. He was thinking more about white Europeans who had been living under the Ottoman Empire or the Prussian Empire. And that explains why no country, no delegation in the Paris Peace Conference even bothered to respond to the demands of the Annamese people. In France itself, no newspaper even bothered talking about it, with one exception, and this is important, L'Humanité, a newspaper founded by the leader of the French socialists, Jean Jaurès. So in the aftermath of his Versailles trip, Ho Chi Minh became more and more radicalized, more and more certain that only independence would do it. What helped is that he discovered at the same time Marxism, as did many people back then in France. For example, the future Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, were students in Paris in the 1920s as well. Having discovered Marxism, Ho Chi Minh joined the SFU, the French section of the Workers' International. But above all, he discovered Lenin's thesis on the national and colonial question. And it was love at first sight. This is how he recalled the first time he read Lenin's thesis. Quote, "What emotion, enthusiasm, clear-sightedness and confidence it instilled in me. I was overjoyed to tears. Though sitting alone in my room, I shouted aloud as if addressing large crowds. 'Dear martyrs, compatriots, this is what we need. This is our path to liberation.'" End quote. What wowed Ho Chi Minh was that Lenin offered a clear explanation of colonial rule and a clear blueprint for national liberation for poor, agricultural, colonial societies like Vietnam. Moreover, through the Comintern, that means the Communist International, Lenin pledged Soviet support for all nationalist uprisings because he wanted a worldwide socialist revolution against the capitalist order. Ho Chi Minh had found a perfect ideological framework for his nationalist struggle. And in addition to being a Vietnamese independentist, as you would say in French, he became as well a true socialist. Ho became a full-time activist, making connections with Irish and Korean militants, writing and organizing. And this activism drew the attention of the French police on one hand, who put him under surveillance, but on the other hand, it drew the attention of the French socialist leaders who invited this young, dynamic Vietnamese militant to attend the party's congress held in the city of Tours in December 1920. And there's a striking picture taken in Tours showing a young, slim and intense-looking Ho Chi Minh addressing the conference and appealing to delegates to support the people of Indochina. But the Tours Congress is famous in France as well because that is where and when a schism happened between the socialists and the communists. You see, the majority of socialist members wanted to join the new international created by Lenin, but a minority of conservative socialists wanted to stay in the old Workers' International. And that's why the SFIO split in two, and Ho Chi Minh sided with the communists. And yes, Ho Chi Minh was a founding member of the French Communist Party. After the Congress, he continued his frenetic activism. He founded a newspaper, Le Paria, the Pariah. He churned out articles left, right, and center. He even wrote and staged an anti-colonial play. But between 1920 and 1923, he made no headway in his anti-colonial struggle. And he came to the depressing realization that the anti-colonial struggle was not a priority for the French Communist Party. If you add to that he was constantly under police surveillance, risking arrest every day, you can understand why he decided to leave Paris for Moscow in June 1923. Ho Chi Minh wanted to meet Lenin and other Soviet leaders with the hope that the Comintern would push the French Communist Party to adopt a more aggressive stance against colonialism. However, there were disappointments in Moscow too. First of all, Lenin was on his deathbed, and he died in January 1924. And that news hit Ho Chi Minh very hard. I mean, imagine an Elvis fan traveling to America to see Elvis in the summer of 1977, just for Elvis to die unexpectedly in August. Well, Ho Chi Minh was very sad, and he joined the crowds waiting for hours in minus 30 degrees to pay their respect to the dead leader. For our American listenership, minus 30 degrees is minus 22 Fahrenheit. That is very cold. And Ho Chi Minh suffered frostbite to his nose and fingers. In Moscow, it seems that he enrolled in the newly formed Communist University of the Toilers of the East, which trained cadres and helped organize revolutionary movements in Asia. What disappointed him, though, is that Moscow was as Eurocentric as Paris was, and there was little interest in his anti-colonial message. But Ho Chi Minh was now a Comintern agent, and in late 1924, he was sent to southern China to organize undercover the first Marxist organization for Indochina. For that purpose, he created the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League and set up a training institute that attracted students from all over Vietnam to Guangzhou between 1925 and 1927. For example, Pham Van Dong, the future PM, joined the Youth League then, and Lê Hồng Phong, a future leader who would die in prison in 1940, passed through Guangzhou before being sent to Moscow by Ho Chi Minh. But the thing to know about the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League is that it was at the time just one communist group among others. Small communist groups had emerged autonomously in Indochina, and there was even a Trotsky cell somewhere around Saigon. But in February 1930, after fleeing Guangzhou for Hong Kong, Ho Chi Minh accomplished a tour de force. He managed to unify all the communist factions, except the Trotskyists, of course. Let's be serious 1 minute. He managed to unify all the communists into one Vietnamese Communist Party. And this was a sort of first Independence Day for Ho Chi Minh, because the Vietnamese Communist Party did not depend on the French one. It was a party in its own right, affiliated to the Comintern. A year later, though, he was instructed by Moscow to rename it the Indochina Communist Party, with the responsibility to spread the revolution to Laos and Cambodia as well. And this is where we will leave Ho Chi Minh for now. In 1930, our friend was a Comintern agent operating from Hong Kong, and he would help form communist parties in Malaysia and in Siam, present-day Thailand. So let us leave him in Hong Kong and return on the ground in Vietnam, because there's a lot of action happening then that is linked to our story. So we just covered the creation of the Vietnamese Communist Party, but this communist unity did not have time to take hold on the ground, because what happened in 1930 is that large peasant uprisings inspired by communist activists broke out in Nghệ An and Hà Tĩnh province. At the root of the turmoil was land inequality. Just one example. In the Mekong Delta in 1938, only 12% of the land was occupied by small owners. The rest, a massive 88%, was exploited by large white and Vietnamese owners. So the Nghệ Tĩnh Soviet started with small demands, reducing rents, for example. But quickly, these movements escalated when these modest demands were dismissed. Landowners were killed, villagers set up committees where sat communists, and these committees started land redistribution. For the colonial administrations, these Bolshevik Soviets had to be crushed. So the French did not mess about, and a brutal crackdown ensued. First, the French colonial administration sent the Air Force, and aerial bombardments were used to disperse demonstrations and punish red villages. After that, they sent the Foreign Legion. The Foreign Legion was unleashed on the ground and went amok in the red villages. The toll was unsurprisingly heavy. 3,000 peasants minimum may have perished. Villages were burned down and leaders were executed when caught. And when it comes to communist leaders, all of them were either killed or thrown to jail, and often they were handed over by local Vietnamese notables who had everything to lose in these shenanigans. The French had prevailed again. And in the aftermath of the Ngay Tin Soviets, the Governor General Pasquier had every right to be happy when he said, quote, "As an active force against public order, communism has disappeared," end quote. And he was right. The entire communist infrastructure was dismantled and out of use for many years. But what Pasquier meant by communists included also the Yen-Bai failed insurrection. In all, the result of French repression in 1930-31 was that it destroyed Vietnamese nationalism. The Vietnamese National Party was dead, and communism was pushed underground or to the margins of Indochina. Vietnamese nationalism was in disarray. After 1931, nationalist leaders, communists and not communists, were almost all jailed on the island of Pulo Condor. And what was a blow in the short term would prove positive in the long term for Vietnamese nationalism. It is a phenomenon similar to what happened in Camp Bucca in Iraq after 2004. The Americans had concentrated there a large number of former collaborators of Saddam Hussein as well as Islamists. That provided those detainees with the opportunity to learn from each other and collaborate. And many of them went on to become leaders in ISIS, including al-Baghdadi. In Vietnam, the penal colony of Pulo Condor became kind of a revolutionary university. Thousands of political prisoners rehashed their hatred of the French. They shared their suffering and they planned their revenge. And there were some big names in Pulo Condor. Nguyen Binh, the future leader of the guerrilla of the Viet Minh in the southeast, was then detained as a VNQDD militant. On the communist side, we can mention Pham Van Dong, we talked about already, and as well Lê Duan, the future communist leader in the 1960s. And it is also at Pulo Condor that the Vietnamese Civil War kind of began, when communists tried to convert VNQDD militants who were anti-communist. Fistfights occurred in cell blocks, and that foreshadows the civil wars. Nguyen Binh, for example, he was then a VNQDD prisoner, lost an eye in one of those fights. So if we take stock in 1931, one, non-communist nationalism no longer existed, the VNQDD having been dismantled, and the Vietnamese bourgeois and royalists having sided with France to protect the rule of law, and with Nguyen Anh Ninh languishing in prison. Number two, the communists were in disarray. France stood indomitable. They had had a scare with Yen Bai and the Ngay Tin Soviets, but might have been right. Imperial France was at the height of its power in the 30s, as shown by the 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition. Indochina, the jewel of the empire, held a prominent role in the exhibition. One of the main attractions was a replica of the Cambodian temple at Angkor Wat. And the young Emperor Bao Dai was the guest of honor at the exhibition. The 1930s are therefore a golden age for the colony. And so confident was France in its power that it refused outright the demands for reform from the new young Emperor Bao Dai. Bao Dai had succeeded his father at the age of 13 in 1926. But right away, he was sent by the Governor General Pasquier to be trained in France. Pasquier had a plan. So by training this young king at age 13, he wanted to make him a Vietnamese king, but with a French mind. So that's why Bao Dai attended some of the most prestigious high schools in Paris. He played tennis and went skiing with children of Parisian political and economical elite. Pasquier's plan was to make him a puppet, basically, of the French. So when Bao Dai came back to Vietnam in 1932, the French did not miss the opportunity. They paraded Bao Dai all around the country. And the thinking was that the masses of Vietnamese people would be less prone to rebel against France if they saw the Son of Heavens working with France. The French even allowed Bao Dai to form a government. In that government sat Pham Nguyen, the old ally of the French, and a young Catholic official who would become the first president of South Vietnam. Those who know the Vietnamese history have recognized Ngo Dinh Diem. The French expected Bao Dai to sit in his palace and just pretend to be an emperor. However, the young emperor surprised his French overlords by demanding that France respect the treaties creating the protectorates. Furthermore, he asked to be allowed to write the constitution for his empire within the Indo-Chinese Federation. Okay, the Vietnamese are trying the old let's work with the French trick again. Did it work? Yeah, no. Pasquier's response was the flat no to all of Bao Dai's demands. And I can imagine a meeting starting and Bao Dai starting to speak and saying, okay, you want to write constitution, blah, blah, blah. And the governor general cutting him off right away. Whoa, 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 whoa. What on earth? A constitution? Respect the treaties? Are you out of your mind? Is this how you repay us? After everything we did for you, we took you to Paris, put you in the best schools, and you come back to Vietnam and stab us in the back like this? I can't believe what I'm hearing here. Anyway, the French could not even contemplate an anti-communist, pro-French Vietnamese administration with the friendly emperor as its leader. As a result of those refusals, Ngo Dinh Diem angrily resigned his position. He would refuse any collaboration with the French and as a result stay out of politics until 1947. As for Bao Dai, he also withdrew from politics. He refused all French requests of collaboration, he refused to go touring the country, and he spent his days in his palace hunting and womanizing. To summarize, in the 30s, French had reduced all the Vietnamese national movement to nothing. And the French house in Indochina looked indestructible from the inside. Only an external event could threaten the French Indochina house. And that event would be World War II. Defeated by Germany in Europe, France would lose its Pearl of the Far East and Japan would occupy Indochina. And one person in particular will be ready to exploit Japanese occupation to further his nationalist views. And that person is our friend Ho Chi Minh. Talking about Japanese occupation in the early 1940s, he would say, quote, that he saw in it a very favorable opportunity for Vietnamese revolution. We must seek every means to return home to take advantage of it, end quote. We will learn all about that in the next episode. Until then, take care and goodbye.
Jackie.